Today we're going to talk about the end of nuclear testing. Nuclear testing began because at first no one knew whether an atomic or hydrogen bomb would work, and then they didn't know how well it would work, what the yield would be. So there was some initial curiosity that had to be satisfied. Then a lot of nuclear tests were needed in order to miniaturize nuclear weapons. The atomic bomb went from this size to this. And the hydrogen bomb went from this size to this. These took a lot of work and a lot of testing. Let's consider three separate cases. The first is high-altitude testing. That means up in the stratosphere and even up into the fringes of outer space. One of the problems that was observed with these tests was that the electromagnetic pulse from a bomb detonated this high in the air, or even above the air, would transmit an electromagnetic pulse which would ruin electronics for hundreds of miles around, in some cases thousands of miles around. And the other reason for not detonating nuclear weapons up there is that we were beginning to put satellites up there. At first, the satellites didn't have very many functions, but now we have satellites for weather forecasting, communications, just about anything you can think of. And they would all suffer from interference by nuclear weapons. Atmospheric testing had its own kinds of problems. The first were fallout problems. Fall into three categories. The first comes from the excess nuclear fuel in the bombs. Neither plutonium nor uranium is a particularly pleasant thing to have in your environment, especially not plutonium. And the most efficient bombs are only about 10% efficient. So that means that 90% of the fuel in those bombs wound up as vapor, which was later going to fall to Earth. The second undesirable products in the fallout are the fission products, the smaller nuclei, which are made as a result of fission of the large ones. These are all radioactive, some of them intensely radioactive, and again, it's something you don't want in your environment. And the third thing are products of neutron activation. So, as the bomb explodes, it gives off large numbers of neutrons. These neutrons come into contact with other materials. The nitrogen of the atmosphere, for instance, will give you carbon-14. Any other materials will also be activated into radioactive materials. And so all of these things were beginning to be realized as dangerous contaminants. And so atmospheric nuclear testing was banned. There are two other reasons for banning atmospheric nuclear testing. Carbon-14 is extremely important to life. Carbon is the predominant constituent of all living material, and all material in all living creatures on Earth come from photosynthesis, from green plants, from algae, from photosynthetic bacteria. All of these things convert atmospheric carbon dioxide into the carbon backbone, the carbon skeleton of all living things. This graph shows how the level of carbon-14 in the atmosphere was tremendously increased by especially thermonuclear weapons testing. This increase was so great in the atmosphere that people thought it had to wind up in plants and therefore in people's foods. So they looked around for an agricultural product that was sold in stores, clearly dated as to its origin. And what they came up with was fine wine. Fine wine is made from grapes, which are in turn made from atmospheric carbon dioxide. And so by measuring the fraction of carbon-14 in wine as a function of year, we can see in this graph that there's a big increase happening at the time of the thermonuclear bomb testing in the atmosphere. So all these things came together with one other factor, and that was if you blow up a really big thermonuclear bomb, it makes such a big fireball that it will rise all the way to the top of Earth's atmosphere, and it will actually boil some of the atmosphere away into outer space. It's not really very much that gets boiled away in any one test, but all of us here on Earth are interested in breathing. And hearing that our atmosphere is being boiled off into space just so some yahoo can test another bomb is not really a good thing. And so all atmospheric testing was banned. And then the next step happened when underground testing was also banned. Now, underground testing eliminates most of the things I've talked about so far, but it leaves one tremendous hazard, and that is the enormous amounts of radiation that are trapped under the ground in the places where the tests have taken place. These are not a big problem if they are immobile, but if the area is ever subjected to flooding, for instance, then there's a risk that the underground contamination can be rinsed into the groundwater, especially into the deep aquifers, and eventually find its way into agricultural water and into human water supplies. This is a very bad thing, and so all testing was banned, which turned out not to be a real catastrophe as far as the bomb designers were concerned, because they'd been doing something else. Throughout the period when the experimentalists were running these tests, the theoreticians had been refining their calculations as to what the yield of these tests should be. And after each test, their calculations got more and more exact, until by the time the U.S. had tested 1,000 nuclear weapons, there really wasn't that much reason for testing anymore, because the theoretical predictions were pretty close to accurate.